Thank you for being here promptly at 9 o'clock. If you don't know me, I'm Matthew Edney, and for my sins, I am both chairing this session and I was asked to step in and I'm presenting in this session, which I haven't done in a very long time, so I will try to not go on and make quite sure the other presenters have their time. The other presenters are going to be Marissa Griffian, Anna-Rika von Scheck, and Bram van Nooy, close enough, Belgian Bram, and Martijn Storms. Once again, I am chairing Marissa. That always happens. So, and this panel is the new conceptual approaches in the history of cartography or map history or whatever I said it was. There we go. So, I'm leap right in. I'm not going to bother introducing the speakers in detail. Their presentations will say enough, and you've got the basic information in the program. So before I start, just while people are filtering in, I thought I would do a very, very, very quick update on the History of Cartography project. As you know, we have 5 out of the 6 volumes are published and are freely available online for public access. The very last volume, volume 5, is in preparation. We just received the first batch of page proofs out of 6 that harvested through the galleries, and we're on the last batch of copy edits. We're doing everything together. It's a big, complex process. What does this mean? It means that the last volume is currently scheduled to be delivered to the press in printed books on the 5th of July of next year, so almost exactly 1 year from now. Then the warehouse has to process the books, and about a month or so after that, they'll actually be available for sale and distribution. And then 3 years after that, it will go online with all the rest of the volumes. And then we'll be done, and I can have my life back. Anyway, so what I want to talk about today is a problem that I've been struggling with for many years. I'm slowly getting a handle on it. Specifically, we have, since the 1980s, been engaged in what I like to call socio-cultural map study. We're studying maps as social instruments and cultural documents. And this is an incredibly productive approach. It's been wonderful. This conference is testament to that. But, and this is the key problem, sociocultural studies emphasize synchronic analysis, the study of maps or a mapping event at a particular moment. It doesn't provide any mechanisms for understanding change over time, to actually tell the history of how mapping practices change over time. We don't have a sense of diachronic change. And the result is, and I won't bore you with examples because I'll use up all my time, but the result is that when we do have people, very sophisticated thinkers, thinking about the big picture, they inevitably resort back to the old progressivist, pre-sociocultural ideas of mapping changing over time, and cartography becoming a science in the Enlightenment and the rest of it. So we need a way to try to figure out how to do change over time. And in that respect, as you probably know, I've been working on this idea of a processual map history. And processual map history does not mean looking at the processes of mapping, of surveying and drafting, engraving, and reading of maps. But rather it's to understand, to approach early maps and mapping practices from the point of always bearing in mind the 3 big processes. Not only of map production, the old emphasis, not only of consumption, which is really the sociocultural emphasis, but also circulation. how the maps themselves move between people from producers and consumers. Producers and consumers are all part of the same system. It's not, oh, there's producers who make a map that is then used by other people. The producers are people who are using the same kinds of maps, they're reading them, consuming them, just as the straight consumers are. So circulation, understanding circulation, thinking about how maps move in the generic, is key to a processual map history. If you think about how different sets of works move, you can start to identify patterns in the production of maps, the consumption of maps, tied together at a very broad level in modes, geographical mapping versus property mapping versus marine mapping versus celestial mapping. They intersect at times, many times they're distinct, they pursue separately. It's a broad heuristic, it's a rule of thumb, never to be studied absolutely. And at the very narrowest level, we can identify very precise circuits in which maps move between limited groups of producers and consumers. And sometimes that circulations are broad and indeterminate because it's a printed marketplace that can go all over. Crucial to a processual approach is the idea that we must de-emphasize map information and content. I'm not saying that map information is unimportant. Absolutely, it is important. But it is not the first thing we look at. It shouldn't be the first thing we look at, put it that way. And it's certainly not the only thing to study. So, what I want to do for the rest of this talk is to give you an example of how this can work. This is from a side project that took a life of its own in the spring. I'm going far, far outside of my comfort zone. You know, I'm a modernist, 18th, 19th, 20th century, and now I'm going to go back into antiquity, in the Middle Ages, about which I know nothing, right? So, work example. For reasons, I started looking at what is cosmography in the Renaissance. And because I am who I am, I wanted to figure out what's the history of cosmography. Where did it come from? And in reading around, including volume 3 of the History of Cartography, it's treated in the Renaissance as a thing. It's already developed. Hasn't come from anywhere. Although some people do say it has origins in classical work. Some people say it has medieval precedents, but they're not really clear what they are. Many authors treat cosmography in the Renaissance as being equivalent to the entirety of what we think of as cartography in the modern age, which is, of course, an ideal, doesn't really exist. And it's just really frustrating. It's not a very clear historical state of affairs. How did cosmography develop? When people are talking in the 15th, 16th century about cosmography, what is it they're actually talking about without imposing modern concepts onto their thought? Against that, there are a whole host of detailed studies about classical medieval studies, mapping and cognitive practices, that suggest there's a great deal of differentiation within cosmography. So Edward Grant, for example, made a study of cosmological and astronomical treatises, which from a modern point of view go together because they're all about the heavens. But Grant argues and demonstrates very clearly that the cosmological literature in antiquity is massively distinct from the astronomical, or really astrological, literature. Daniela Dweck, trying to deal with classical geography in the Roman Greek period, ended up having to split geography into 3 sets of practices. They're still rather too engrossed. She still has a category of cartography involving everything from surveying of property to mapping the Earth. But anyway, but she starts to separate out geography into distinct areas of practice. David Woodward, a couple of times, identified the difference in classical medieval practice between mapping the whole world versus just the ecumen, the inhabited world. And there's been all these recent studies by Gautier Boucher, Edney Edson, Alfred Hyatt. They're all really problematize and complex, and complicate medieval Western Islamic mapping practices as they inherit classical material and create new kinds of work. So in this kind of context, we can identify three kinds of distinct areas of classical scholarship, which all deal in various ways with modern ideas of space and maps, but are not necessarily unified in the classical period. The first of these is cosmology, very much a philosophical approach. This is Aristotle thinking about the spheres of the cosmos and how the sun relates to the earth and dividing up the earth into 5 climatic zones, too frigid, too temperate, and the torrid around the equator. This is the kind of thought in which Practices of Manos made the first attested terrestrial globe, 4 chunks of land inhabiting the 2 temperate zones as part of his critique of Homer's Odyssey. The second category of work is that of history, and history-related ideas, poetry, as a practice as literary as much as it is graphic, is characterized in particular by the idea of the periodos or the periogesis, the circuit, whether you're writing about a place following a circuit around it, or whether you're mapping the earth within the circuit of the lands. So the Greek periodos gaze, the circuit of the lands, attested in plays and so on, or the Roman equivalent, the orbis terrae, orbis terrarum. Orbis, of course, meaning a circle in the original Latin. And these move back and forth between textual accounts of the ecumen and graphic accounts of the ecumen, and just the ecumen. And of course, I'm using medieval images because we don't have any classical. The third set of scholarship in the classical period seems to be the astrological, from which geography, per se, seems to stem. This is geography, this is the earth as it relates to the heavens. And it's the astrologers who are deeply involved in mapping the stars, in tracing the movements of the planets and the sun over time, doing all the observational work that the cosmologists don't give a fig about. The astrologers want to know about where the planets are. And they really want to know how the Earth's surface relates to the celestial sphere, so you can relate the two together. And this is where I think you get Eratosthenes, and you definitely get Ptolemy, who's an astrologer first and foremost. It's heavily observational. It's all about Earth and the heavens as one mathematical system. So as I say, this is the context in which Eratosthenes is writing, that Ptolemy is writing, between Marinus of Tyre and so on, trying to understand the places on the Earth in the same mathematical framework as is being applied to the celestial vault. And then we get the Middle Ages, and I come to realize that if you set aside dietary and health issues, I would love to have been a medieval scholar. They're bringing in all this new material, either directly from classical sources via Islam and all the Islamic changes that are going on, being made and adapted and created and then brought into Europe. And all of a sudden they start to see, oh, well, look, Aristotle's talking about the heavens, and Ptolemy in the Almagest is talking about the heavens. We need to relate these together. It's the same topic. And they start to blend all these distinct things together. So, you end up with this. You've got the cosmological line. Classical zonal Earth, spheres of the cosmos expressed in the Macrobian zonal diagrams. You've got another line of history, of the historical descriptions, of geographical descriptions and regional mapping, and map by Mundi, which eventually is going to give rise to Fraumaro, the Genoese map, and so on. You've got a point of intersection, a point of connection between them when Beatus makes the four continent world maps to show religious issues. Then you've got the astrological line, Eratosthenes, Ptolemy, which informs Sacrobosco, Roger Bacon. Heavily influenced by cosmology, Sacrobosco trying to bring them all together, and everybody else trying to, Processual trying to bring them together and correlate them. You have these intriguing connections. Alfred Hyam's essay on the transition of the 7 Ptolemaic astrological climes from his work through Islamic work into medieval Europe is just phenomenal in that respect. And then you've got this whole new thing in the Middle Ages, this empirical marine-based work that starts to, with an expanded acumen, as the European acumen just continues to increase, starts to produce ever more larger maps, typically the Catalan Atlas, but others. And that trend is going to lead into Juan de la Cosa and all the planispheres of the Renaissance. And then the real complication, astronomical navigation, using astrological techniques for navigation for the Portuguese as they get down towards the equator. That informs marine empirical. Marine empirical is informing everybody else. And I've got to stop, and it gets very complex. And the whole point is, 2 big lines come out and they continue as separate trends into the Renaissance. It's not one kind of world mapping in the Renaissance. We're inheriting 2 from the Middle Ages and moving forward.